Hello and welcome to today's Tech Tuesday webcast, NetBackup Tips and Tricks to Make Your Life Easier, brought to you by Insight Cloud and Data Center Transformation. I'm Amanda Sharp, Marketing Specialist at Insight Cloud and Data Center Transformation, and I will be your moderator today. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. This webcast is designed to be interactive between you and the presenters. The webcast console you are looking at can be completely customized. You can resize or move any of the windows that you have open. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your questions. All questions from this webcast will be captured. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please visit the webcast help guide by clicking on the question mark icon below the presentation window. The help guide covers common technical issues. I would now like to turn the presentation over to our presenter, Nick Bennett. Nick, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks Amanda, and welcome everyone to today's Tech Tuesday. We'll be going over some NetBackup tips and tricks, and there are a few pretty verbose commands in the presentation. So we've included a PDF of the slides in the resources widget that is, I guess, on your screen. So you can access the commands and copy paste them out into your notes if you want to use them in the future. So our table of contents, today we'll go over best practices, NetBackup Appliance, isolate performance problems, and some NetBackup commands that can be handy and helpful. We'll start with best practices. One of the main things to do is test your restores often, which sounds pretty obvious, but what a lot of folks I found get into is making sure that they've got a good completion percentage for their backups, but don't test their restores very often. And what you'll run into in that case is being less familiar with your restore procedure. And then, when you're under the gun having to get that restore done, you're less familiar with it and it just is more painful. So especially after you make any environment changes such as MSDP, if you replace a data domain, if you upgrade your data stores, any of these domain changes, these are all flags to go ahead and test your restore process again and make sure that you're very familiar with it. Another tip is to browse your backups. You want to open up your backup archive and restore GUI. Take a look at some of your backups, especially if you're doing VMware backups with application state capture. A lot of times that can get pretty deep and it will be pulling databases and things like that, and you'll want to make sure that all of your databases or Exchange data, for instance, is in fact backed up. So you want to check that on a regular basis. You also want to have good documentation for everything. This is especially important if you have multiple administrators at your site. It should be readable and easy to follow, and make sure that you document your catalog backup location and have a good DR plan. Another thing that some folks have had trouble with is forgetting to copy out your installation keys. If you do need to do a reinstall, you of course need your installation keys again. So having those separate somewhere can save you some heartache. We'll move on to the NetBackup Appliance. So if you make any changes to the appliance, generally you're going to want to do that from the CLISH, especially the password. There are other configuration files that get changed when you change the password, so you'll want to do that from the CLISH only. Also to note is performance degrades on appliances as they get closer to full due to fingerprint cache and memory usage as fluidity. This is the case for most deduplication appliances, whether they're NetBackup or other. You also want to protect separately the MSDP catalog. A lot of folks will protect the NetBackup catalog, of course, but miss the MSDP catalog in the config files. You can, at the end of this, there's some links with details on how to get this done, but you'll want to have these in place. And whenever you call support, one of the first things we're going to ask you is for the serial number. And if you don't have that handy, a quick way to grab that is with this command. If you're having some problems with your appliance and you're not really able to isolate that through logging, this VX log view looking at your app logs product ID can be helpful because it's going to just display all errors and warnings, and in this case, it's just going to display it for the last hour. If you're running backups to your MSDP and you're finding that your MSDP seems to be bloated, you can run this bpstsinfo compare dbnsu command. And this command is helpful. What it does is compare what is on the MSDP catalog to what's in the NetBackup catalog. And if there's a discrepancy, it will spit that out. It'll say something along the lines of only on storage or only in NetBackup. And if it says only on storage, that is an orphaned image. We have a knowledge base article that goes into more depth on that and how to mitigate it. And that's through this KB number, and you can find that in the after you log into ServiceNow and search for this KB. So as we move on, if you're finding that your storage is marked down a lot and it's coming back up on its own, maybe after a minute or several minutes, what might be happening is that one of the other media servers has jumped in and become the monitor for that local MSDP pool. Quick way to check this is in the EMM log, and you can grep for monitored by. And what that will show is it'll show who's monitoring the local MSDP pool. And if it's not monitored by itself, you'll want to remove all of the other media servers from the storage server credentials and go ahead and run this bpstsinfo resync rem. And that will bring the monitoring back to itself, which is ideal. So one of the problems that we see frequently with the 5330s is this LUN trespass event, and it will say something along the lines of storage status not optimal. These two commands can both verify and then reset the storage array volume distribution. Doing that will bring it back into the correct path for the storage. If you're having an issue where you're finding that you're running short on space on the appliance under the root volume, you can run a find as it's displayed here with the max depth in the mount and tell it the path. Another way to do that, if you're not able to find what is taking up all of the space, is go ahead and mount that root file system on your advanced disk if you have enough space, or any other file system that has enough space, and search there. When you're going into upgrades, sometimes you can run into space issues that don't really correspond to your DF output. Everything seems to have enough space, but you're still getting a space issue. And one of the reasons for that can be an old checkpoint or an old snapshot. So you can take a look at existing snapshots with this command, and then the command below is to remove it. If you're having issues with connecting to your appliance to grab logs and data, one thing that you can use as a workaround is just a local Python HTTP server. You can open that up on the command line, where you'll want to start this from the directory that you want to download the files from, and then you can just go to a browser and browse out to that and download the files that way. So we'll move on to the next, where we're going to be isolating some problems, and start with performance and tips. So if you have a client that has been consistently backing up within several hours, and now it's taking half a day or something like that, a helpful way to isolate that is to test the local client disk reads, and you can use a BPV-car to null test to do that. It's going to isolate the backup activity to just that local disk. You can also do that with an NFS mount if you think that maybe your NAS is having some disk latency issues or connectivity issues or anything along those lines. The main thing here is to create the BPV-car log on that client and set verbose logging to 5 and let it run through this backup. And at the end of the backup, it will give you a disk speed summary, which you can compare to what it should be for what, whether it's NFS or the local disks. So if you're having connectivity issues, there's the 3 main NetBackup ports that need to be opened bidirectionally between a media server and a client, and those are 1556, 13724, and 13782. here's a couple of ways that you can test that connectivity from a client. What I've found is that a lot of folks don't have Telnet installed on servers anymore. And so my go-to would typically be to use Telnet to do this. If we can't install that or it isn't available in the local server for a Windows client, you can use a PowerShell command. This test net connection is, you don't have to do any separate install to use that. So that can be helpful. So if you have a job that is running slowly, typically by the end of that job, you're going to have a line that says, or maybe several lines that say, for instance, BPTM was delayed or waited for full X number of times and was delayed X number of times. So that is in increments of 15 milliseconds, which is, pretty painful to try and figure out what that means in terms of minutes or hours. So this batch script is something that I used a few years ago to help me just cut and paste the delays in the job details and display that out. So it might be handy to have that if you're just looking to compare between jobs. And again, at the end of this presentation, there's several links that go into more detail about these. So you can check that when we're done. So we'll move on to logs. So if you're, troubleshooting a problem and it's a performance problem, typically you're going to check your logs to see if there's anything going on. You can check any legacy log for a 16 or a 32, such as this, and it will display the error. What a lot of times will happen, though, is you're going to try and hunt down that problem, but it may be that the preceding lines will give you more in-depth information about what might be going on just prior to that error, as usually the error is just the result, and that's where your stop point is. So a quick tip is just to check around that as well. And if you're not sure which log will show your failure, you can gather them all using MPCP logs. It's a handy tool that's under the NetBackup installation path and bin support. And these are a few examples of how you can run that. There's a man page for that as well that you can use. There's several different options with this. And by default, when you run this, it will also run a NBSU. If you find that you're taking up a lot of logging space on the server in question, you can actually set your unified logging for all of your originator IDs using the default as seen here, which can be helpful if you're not sure which log might be taking up a lot of space or if you just want to do a clean sweep. So if you're unsure of which log to grab as far as isolating a performance issue or maybe trying to troubleshoot a problem, you can create your failure and run a VX log view and just set it for a specific time. In this case, it's 5 minutes back, and I'll put that into a file and just kind of look through that file to get an idea what's going on. When you find some hits as far as some errors or things to look at, you can go back and actually grab more detail from the respective log. Okay, so we'll move on to some of the NetBackup commands that can be handy. So kill multiple processes by name on Linux servers. So this can be handy if you're running into a situation where maybe you're out of space in the root volume and commands are not really responding to what you want, such as netbackup stop or a bp.killall. You can grep for the process in question. BPTM is a likely candidate because it's going to have hooks into clients, and so a lot of the times on a media server, it might hang out there if you're having an issue locally with processing or memory or whatever else. So this can be a handy command just to go ahead and kill all those in one fell swoop so you don't have to go ahead and kill them individually. You can expire multiple backup IDs. This can be helpful because, of course, you can expire multiple backup IDs in the admin console under catalog, but what we find sometimes is that these images that you want to expire are associated with an SLP, and if they're associated with an SLP, they won't expire. And what you'll have to do to actually expire those is add a switch with this force not complete switch. But of course, if you have hundreds of backup IDs that you want to expire, that can get a bit cumbersome. So one option is to generate a list of backup IDs. Typically what I will do with this is, depending on how you get the backup IDs, it's up to you, but once I get that, I'll copy that into an Excel document and then copy the column with the backup IDs. And you can just paste that back into a list file. And the Linux version of that is just catting this list into an Xargs like this. And there's a Windows batch file I got from a customer a couple of years ago that's been handy for multiple cases, and this is the example of that. What this will do is you just run it from a command line, and it'll sit there at a prompt, and you can cut and paste your list right into your command prompt, and it will run the command, BP expedite backup ID on each in that list. So another popular option for running this similarly is with the mbstl util cancel. If you don't want to cancel out everything in your lifecycle policy, but just want to focus in on a number of backup IDs, this format can be helpful for that too. So there's a few NDMP, less known NDMP touch files. One of them is the NDMP data connection hostname equals IP, and this can be helpful for specifying the interface on a media server for your NDMP connections. If you're using, multiple NICs on a media server and you want data to go over a certain path, you can set this. There's the NDMP mover client disable, and this will enable block by block data transfer with the NDMP tape interface, which should be helpful. If you are in an IPv4 environment, there's no good reason necessarily to have your IPv6 connections listening, so you can actually disable that, and then it won't try. Commonly, if you're making a domain name change, you're making IP changes to clients, especially media servers and especially master servers, you'll want to go ahead and clear host cache on those local hosts prior to trying to make connections or run backups again. Also, more recently, I've found that a few of the certificate errors that are prone in 8.1 plus have been resolved with this clear host cache, because they have some dirty cache entries for the host that aren't associated with the certificate properly. So that has come in handy. You can also run use BPIM media to run daily reports. There's a quick example below here where it's going to grab everything, and you can output that to a file. You can script it locally and have it email you. You can just script it locally and have it saved locally. The free version of Op Center supplied with NetBackup has built-in report templates that are similar to that as well. So, okay, and as I said earlier, here's a couple of reference links, starting with the Data Link Service Portal. When you're logged into ServiceNow, if you go to this URL/SP, you can actually search the knowledge base for published DBs, and we're publishing, we're publishing multiple daily, so you should see an increase in knowledge base articles out there that you can use for reference. And other than that, we have the references for the other things that I had talked about earlier. And that should do it. I don't know why it went to commands continued, but here we go. Thank you for attending today's Tech Tuesday, and I hope that can be helpful in the future for you.
Thank you for attending today's webcast. An on-demand version of this webcast will be available within 2 to 3 days of the webcast. You will receive an email notification once the recording is available. Thank you again for participating in today's webcast.